The man holding the gun wasn't the most dangerous person in that room. Calvin Marsh was. And nobody, not the police outside, not the 43 employees crouched under their desks, not the CEO of a $200 million company trembling in the corner of conference room B. Nobody knew it yet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we get to the moment a single father from Tulsa, Oklahoma stood in the middle of a hostage situation with nothing but a fire extinguisher and 30 seconds of nerve, you need to understand who Calvin Marsh was on a normal Tuesday morning. You need to understand what he drove, what he ate for breakfast, what he said to his 9-year-old daughter every single day before she walked through the doors of Ridgeway Elementary. Because the ordinary details matter here. They matter because what happened inside the Cornerstone Distribution Building on the morning of April 11th was not random. It was not luck, and it was most certainly not a coincidence. It was the product of a quiet man who had spent years building something inside himself that nobody in that building had thought to look for. So let's go back. Let's go back to the kind of Tuesday that starts like every other Tuesday. Cold coffee, a missing shoe, and a little girl with a gap-toothed smile who can talk your ear off about sea otters for 20 straight minutes without stopping for breath. Calvin Marsh was 38 years old. He was not tall enough to be intimidating and not loud enough to be memorable. He drove a 2011 Ford F-150 with a crack in the passenger side windshield that he kept meaning to fix, and he made his coffee in a dented percolator that his mother had given him 6 years ago, 2 months before she passed. He still used that percolator every morning. He still thought about her every time the coffee started to hiss. He lived in a 2-bedroom rental house on the east side of Tulsa, in a neighborhood that used to be working class and was slowly, stubbornly, still trying to hold on to that label. The house had a leaning fence that the landlord never fixed and a backyard big enough for Sadie to set up her telescope on clear nights, which she did at least twice a week, always insisting that Calvin come look, even when he had early shifts and his eyes barely stayed open. He always came to look. Sadie was 9, and she had her mother's eyes, a dark, warm brown that caught the light like river water in August. Her mother, Paulette, had died when Sadie was 4. Pancreatic cancer, the fast kind, the kind that didn't give you much time to do anything except figure out what mattered most. Calvin quit the career track he'd been on at the time. He'd been 3 years into a logistics manager position with a freight company in Dallas, and moved back to Tulsa to be close to Paulette's mother, who could help with Sadie while he got back on his feet. Getting back on his feet took longer than he expected. By the time Sadie was in kindergarten, Calvin had landed at Cornerstone Distribution, a mid-sized shipping and warehousing company headquartered in a squat, beige industrial complex just off Highway 75. The pay wasn't exceptional, but it was steady, and the warehouse supervisor role gave him a schedule he could work around school pickups and parent-teacher conferences and the 100 small logistical crises of raising a child alone. He had been there 4 years. In those 4 years, he had become something that most large companies quietly depend on, but almost never officially recognize: the person who actually makes things work. Calvin knew every shipping lane, every driver's preferred route, every loading dock quirk, and inventory software workaround. When something broke down, people didn't call their manager. They called Calvin. He had once rerouted an entire day's shipments during a server outage using a whiteboard, 2 walkie-talkies, and what a co-worker named Phil Denon later described as some kind of voodoo patience. Phil had worked beside Calvin for 3 of those 4 years. He was 52, recently divorced, and had a habit of bringing the wrong lunch every single day, either too little food or an inexplicable amount of it. He kept a framed photo of his golden retriever on his desk the way other people kept photos of their kids. He was one of the few people at Cornerstone who knew that Calvin went to the shooting range on Thursday evenings. Not because Calvin kept it secret, Exactly. It was just that nobody ever asked. You'd think a coworker noticing a man slip out every Thursday with a range bag would prompt at least a question, but at Cornerstone, people mostly kept their heads down. It was that kind of place. "You any good?" Phil had asked, the first time he noticed. Calvin had paused, considered the question with the same careful economy he applied to most things, and said, "Good enough." Phil had laughed. He didn't know what that meant. He should have asked. There was something else about Calvin Marsh that didn't come up at work, partly because he didn't wear it on his sleeve and partly because he had spent the last several years actively trying to be something other than who he used to be. Before Paulette, before Sadie, before the leaning fence and the dented percolator and the 4 years at a beige industrial complex off Highway 75. Calvin had been an Army Ranger, 75th Ranger Regiment, out of Fort Benning. He'd done 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, and a 3rd rotation he still didn't talk about in specific terms. He'd been honorably discharged at 29, not because anything went wrong, but because Paulette was pregnant with Sadie, and Calvin had made a decision, quietly and firmly, that the life he wanted to build was not compatible with the life he currently had. He came home, and he put that version of himself on a shelf. He didn't delete it. He didn't pretend it hadn't happened. He just separated it. The way you put a tool in a case and latch it shut and slide it under the workbench. Not because you'll never need it again, but because you hope you won't. Thursday evenings at the range were the only visible evidence that the tool still existed. He kept his marksmanship current not out of habit or nostalgia, but out of the same quiet discipline that made him a good father and a reliable supervisor. He believed, in a way he never articulated to anyone, that letting your skills erode was a form of dishonesty. You'd built them. They belonged to you. You owed it to yourself to keep them honest. Sadie knew he went to the range. She called it Daddy's Thursday thing. She also knew, because Calvin believed in telling her the truth in age-appropriate language, that her father had once been in the Army, that the Army trained him to do things that were sometimes dangerous, and that he had chosen to come home because he loved her more than anything else on earth. She thought about that sometimes, when she looked through her telescope at the stars. The distance between things. How far away a person could be, and how fast they could come back when it mattered. She was 9. She thought about things like that. She had no idea that in approximately 72 hours, what her father had put on the shelf was going to come back down. Here's the first thing you need to know about Jeffrey Prescott. He had never once eaten lunch in the Cornerstone cafeteria. Not once. In 11 years as chief executive officer of the company he had built from a regional courier operation into a multi-state distribution network, Jeffrey Prescott had never sat down with his employees over a Tuesday soup and a plastic fork. He had lunch in his office, or at one of 3 restaurants he rotated through, or occasionally at the country club 15 minutes north of the building, where the parking lot was better. He was 56. Silver-haired in the way that photographs well. He wore slim-cut Italian suits in a warehouse environment the way some men wear cologne in a gym, not for others, exactly, but as a reminder of who he was in context that might otherwise confuse him. He had built something real. You couldn't take that away from him. Cornerstone had started in a 2-bay garage in Broken Arrow with 6 employees and 1 contract. And the fact that it now employed over 400 people across 3 states was a genuine accomplishment born of genuine effort. He had worked 60-hour weeks for a decade. He had taken the calls at 2 a.m. He had mortgaged things that scared him. But somewhere along the way, and this is how it happens to a certain kind of man, the building had become more important than the people doing the building. He had stopped seeing his employees as people with Tuesday soups and broken windshields and deceased mothers and daughters who loved sea otters. He had started seeing them as line items, as variables in an efficiency equation, as costs to be managed. And so when the consulting firm he'd hired presented their 6-week analysis on a Monday afternoon in March, and the report recommended eliminating the entire warehouse operations supervisory tier, 12 positions total, including Calvin's, and outsourcing those functions to a third-party logistics provider in Kansas City. Jeffrey Prescott had looked at the numbers, looked at the projected savings, and said, "When can we implement?" The announcement was scheduled for the following Tuesday, April 11th. The affected employees would be notified in a group meeting in conference room B at 9 o'clock in the morning. Calvin didn't know this yet, but there was someone else who did. Ray Hollis had known for 3 weeks. He'd been one of the 12, a loading dock supervisor with 19 years at Cornerstone, the kind of tenure that stops being impressive and starts being heartbreaking when a company decides it no longer needs you. He was 58 years old. He had a bad left knee from an old forklift incident and a daughter in her second year at OSU who he helped with tuition. He had a small house in Sapulpa and a used Chevy Silverado, and a very clear understanding that at 58, with no college degree and a knee that swelled up in the cold, starting over was not a plan, it was a threat. But Ray hadn't been included in the April 11th meeting. Ray had been called into HR 6 weeks earlier, privately, quietly, and handed a separation agreement with a number that Jeffrey Prescott considered generous and Ray Hollis considered an insult. He had signed it. He'd had no choice. But he hadn't stopped thinking about it. He hadn't stopped thinking about 19 years. About the mornings he'd come in early without being asked. About covering shifts that nobody else would cover. About the Christmas he'd worked through so that 2 younger guys with kids could go home. 19 years, and a separation package, and a form to sign by the end of the month. He'd spent the 6 weeks since in a particular kind of spiral that people who have never lost something foundational don't fully understand. Not just the job, but the identity. The answer to what do you do? The structure of getting up in the morning. The sense that your presence somewhere is required. What he was planning on April 11th, he hadn't been planning it for all 6 weeks. It had started as a fantasy, the way desperate thoughts sometimes do. A way to feel powerful in a moment of profound powerlessness. But somewhere in week 4, the fantasy had hardened into something else. He drove to the Cornerstone building in his Chevy Silverado. He parked in the visitor lot. He went through the side entrance that he knew from 19 years was usually propped open by the loading crew on cold mornings because the heater on that side of the building had never worked right. He was carrying a Glock 19 he'd purchased legally 3 years ago and never fired at anything except paper targets. He was not thinking clearly. He was thinking about 19 years. And now we need to talk about what happened the morning of April 11th. Because everything that matters, everything that ends with a CEO speechless in the corner of a conference room, and a single father standing in the eye of something he was never supposed to be standing in, begins with a babysitter named Trudy Walcott calling Calvin Marsh at 7:14 in the morning. "Calvin, honey, I am so sorry." Trudy was 64, sweet-natured, had been watching Sadie on school holidays and sick days for 2 years. "I've got my sister visiting. She took a bad fall last night. They think it's her hip. I am just beside myself. I cannot come in today." Calvin had been standing in the kitchen in his work boots and a Cornerstone fleece, pouring coffee into the dented Percolator's travel companion, a blue thermos that said, "World's okayest dad," because Sadie had given it to him for his birthday and thought the joke was absolutely hilarious. He processed Trudy's words without reacting to them, which was something people who knew Calvin found slightly unnerving. He didn't say, "Oh no," or "That's terrible." He just went quiet for a beat, sorting through variables. School was closed, teacher professional development day, which was why Trudy had been scheduled in the first place. Sadie's grandmother, Paulette's mother Ruth, was in Muskogee visiting her other daughter. Phil could not watch a 9-year-old, And Calvin knew this with certainty because Phil had once lost his own dog in his own fenced backyard for 4 hours. There was no backup. There was no option C. He would have to bring Sadie to work. It wasn't unheard of. He'd done it twice before, both times on slow Fridays when the warehouse was half-staffed. He had a routine for it. Sadie sat in the break room with her backpack full of books and art supplies and her tablet loaded with nature documentaries. She was quiet, self-contained, polite to anyone who spoke to her. She had done this before without incident. He had no reason to believe today would be different. "Get your backpack, bug," he said, leaning into her doorway. She was already sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, because she had heard him on the phone and she knew what a canceled babysitter voice sounded like. "You're coming with me today." Sadie's face did the thing it always did, the gap-toothed smile, the flicker of excitement she tried and failed to suppress. "Can I bring my drawing stuff?" Already in the bag. He'd packed it while she slept. That was Calvin. She climbed out of bed and padded across the floor in her sock feet and pressed her face against his ribs in what she called the hug that sticks. He put one hand on the back of her head. Carefully, the way you hold something you know is the most important thing in the world. "Today's going to be fine," he told her. He believed that when he said it. He would not believe it for much longer. They arrived at Cornerstone at 8:11 a.m. Calvin signed Sadie in at the front desk, visitor badge, the whole routine, and walked her back to the second-floor break room, the one with the window that looked out over the parking lot and the good vending machine that still had the jalapeno chips Sadie inexplicably loved. "Stay here, eat something, do your drawings," he said. "I'll check on you every hour. Don't leave this room without coming to find me first." "I know, Dad. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." She rolled her eyes, which was new this year, and which he secretly found endearing while publicly maintaining the position that eye-rolling was disrespectful. "Yes, sir." He ruffled her hair. He went downstairs. He was not aware that upstairs, in conference room B, one floor above the break room and 40 feet down the hall, Jeffrey Prescott was arranging name placards and a catered breakfast that nobody was going to feel much like eating, preparing for a 9 o'clock meeting that was going to change 12 people's lives. He was not aware that in the visitor parking lot, a used Chevy Silverado had just pulled in. He was not aware of any of it. He was in the warehouse, running through the morning's manifest with Phil Denton, who had brought an enormous submarine sandwich for breakfast, which he was eating at 8:07 in the morning without any apparent self-consciousness. "Big sub for 8 a.m., Calvin said. "Breakfast sub," Phil said. "Different category." Calvin almost smiled. He was going through the day's load sheets. Everything looked normal. A Tuesday like every other Tuesday. The call came to the warehouse floor at 8:49. Not a phone call. A sound. A short, sharp bang from somewhere above them, from the direction of the offices, followed 11 seconds later by a woman's scream that cut off too fast, the way sounds do when someone makes a choice to silence them. The warehouse floor froze. 60-odd seconds of collective confusion, the kind where everyone hears the same thing and each person is separately hoping someone else will explain it away. A pallet falling. A car backfiring outside. Something normal. Something with a boring explanation. Then the building's PA system clicked on. Ray Hollis's voice, hoarse, unsteady, climbing in pitch in a way that told you everything you needed to know about how close to the edge of himself he was, filled every speaker on every floor of the Cornerstone building. "Everybody stay where you are. I've got people in conference room B, and I've got a gun. And if anyone tries to leave this building or call the police." He paused. "Just stay where you are." The PA clicked off. Nobody on the warehouse floor moved for a full 4 seconds. Then Calvin looked at Phil. Phil's breakfast sub was on the ground. His face had gone the color of old chalk. "Sadie." Calvin said her name once, quietly, and then he was already moving. He took the stairs to the second floor at a controlled run, not a sprint, a careful, practiced escalation of speed that kept his footfall quiet and his breathing even. The stairwell was empty. The second floor hallway was empty. He reached the break room and pushed the door open. Sadie was standing at the window with her hands pressed flat to the glass, looking down at the parking lot, where two police cruisers had just pulled in. She turned when she heard him come in, and her face was doing something complicated, not quite scared, not quite calm, hovering in the space between because she was reading his face and hadn't decided how to feel yet. "Dad." Her voice was small and precise. "What's happening?" Calvin crossed the room, knelt in front of her. He put his hands on her shoulders and made eye contact and held it. "There's a situation in the building. It's being handled. I need you to do something important for me." "Okay. I need you to go into the bathroom right there." He pointed to the break room's small attached restroom. "And lock the door and sit on the floor against the wall that doesn't share with the hallway. You know which one that is." She looked at the wall, nodded. "And you're going to stay there until I come get you, or until someone with a police badge shows you their badge through the crack under the door and tells you it's safe. You don't open that door for anyone else. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." "What do you do if someone knocks and doesn't show you a badge?" "I stay quiet." "Good girl." He pulled her in for exactly 3 seconds of the hug that sticks. He felt her arms wrap around his ribs the way they always did, tight and specific, like she was memorizing the shape of him. "Are you scared?" she asked into his shirt. He thought about the honest answer. He thought about everything he'd told her about telling the truth. "A little," he said, "but scared and able are different things." She pulled back and looked at him, and he could see her cataloging that, filing it somewhere she'd think about later. "Okay," she said. "Be careful." He walked her to the bathroom door. He waited until he heard the lock click. Then he turned around and began to think. This is where the story gets complicated in a way that matters. Because Calvin Marsh was not a movie hero. He did not have a plan. He was standing in an empty break room on the second floor of a shipping company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, unarmed, in a cornerstone fleece, with a 9-year-old daughter locked in a bathroom 12 feet behind him, and a man with a gun somewhere down the hall holding somewhere between 8 and 15 people hostage. The police were outside. He could see more units arriving through the break room window. Standard protocol in an active hostage situation meant negotiators, a perimeter, communication, a process. A structured response designed to resolve the situation without casualties. The right thing to do, the obvious thing, the thing any reasonable person would do, was to secure his daughter, stay low, and let the professionals handle it. And that's exactly what Calvin intended to do. For approximately 4 minutes, that's exactly what he did. He was crouched against the wall beside the break room door, listening. Not frozen, listening, which is a different thing, mapping the audio landscape of the floor above him. He could hear Ray's voice, muffled through the ceiling, cycling between anger and tears the way a person does when they've done something they can't undo and are only now fully understanding that. He could hear, faintly, someone responding. Probably Jeffrey Prescott, Calvin guessed. Doing the thing people of a certain authority instinctively do in crisis situations, which is talk. Keep talking, fill the silence. He had almost talked himself into staying put. And then he heard footsteps in the hallway. Quick, purposeful, heading toward the break room. He stood. He pressed himself behind the door. The door opened. Ray Hollis was in the doorway. He was sweating. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild with the particular look of a man who had crossed a line 3 steps ago and was still trying to figure out when exactly it happened. He had the Glock in his right hand, and in his left, by the wrist, was a young woman Calvin recognized, Sandra Briggs, the HR manager, the one who had handed Ray his separation agreement 6 weeks ago. Ray scanned the room. His eyes landed on the bathroom door, on the thin strip of light under it. His face changed. "Who's in there?" Calvin stepped out from behind the door. Ray swung around, the gun coming up, and for one excruciating half-second the barrel was pointed at Calvin's chest from 8 feet away. "Who are you?" Ray's voice cracked on the last word. "Calvin Marsh. I run warehouse ops." He kept his voice at the same register he used when he was talking someone through a damaged shipment. Even, unhurried, professionally human. "You're Ray Hollis. Loading dock, 19 years. Something shifted in Ray's face. The gun did not lower. "How do you know that?" "Because I know everyone who works here." "Worked here." Calvin let that settle. "Ray, who's in that bathroom is my daughter. She's 9 years old. She has nothing to do with any of this." Ray's eyes cut to the bathroom door again. His grip on Sandra's wrist tightened. "She shouldn't be here." "I know. It's a professional development day. My babysitter canceled." "This isn't." Ray shook his head, something fracturing in his expression. "This wasn't supposed to involve kids." "I know. She needs to come out where I can see her." His voice went to a place that turned Calvin's blood cold. "Everyone comes with me to the conference room. I can't have people I don't know about." "Ray, don't." The gun leveled again. "Bring her out. Now." He pulled Sandra closer. "Or I swear to God." And then he said it. The words that would echo in every report, every news story, every retelling of what happened in the Cornerstone building on April 11th. "Don't move, or I'll shoot her." Meaning Sandra. Meaning the HR manager whose only crime that morning had been walking into work with a cup of Starbucks coffee and a folder of termination paperwork she hadn't written. Meaning, my patience is gone, and the next choice you make is going to determine whether anyone walks out of this building hurt. Calvin looked at Sandra. Her face was a mask of controlled terror. She was doing her best, holding it together, but her hands were shaking and her eyes were asking him something desperate and specific. He looked at Ray, at the gun, at the way Ray's trigger hand was trembling slightly, not from intent but from adrenaline, a body that had overproduced fight-or-flight hormones and hadn't fully calculated what it was doing with them. He looked at the bathroom door. He thought about Sadie on the floor against the inside wall. He thought about her arms around his ribs. He thought about scared and able are different things. And then he made a decision. Not a reckless one. Not a desperate one. A calculated, precise, trained decision made by a man who had not used a particular skill set in 9 years, but had never allowed it to go dull. He said, "Okay, Ray, I hear you." He walked to the bathroom door. He knocked twice. "Sadie, it's Dad. I need you to open the door for a minute." Silence. Then, "Did someone show me a badge?" Despite everything, despite the gun 8 feet away, despite Sandra's shaking hands, despite the weight of the next 60 seconds pressing down on him like something physical, Calvin almost smiled. "No badge, but I'm asking you to trust me." A pause. The lock clicked. The door opened 3 inches. Sadie's eyes appeared in the gap, found his face, read it the way she always read it. "Come stand next to me," Calvin said. "It's okay." She came out. She was clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She looked at Ray. She looked at the gun. She looked back at her father. She did not make a sound. Calvin put one hand on Sadie's shoulder and turned back to Ray. "All right," he said. "We're coming with you. But I need you to hear something first, and I need you to really hear it, because what I'm about to say is going to matter to you." Ray frowned. "There's nothing." 19 years, Calvin said. Ray went still. "I know about the separation. I know what they paid you. I know you're 58 with a bad knee and a kid in college and a signed paper that doesn't come close to making that right." Calvin kept his voice low and level, like a hand extended across a table. "I know, Ray. Because I've been here 4 years, and I know this company, and I know what it does to people it decides it doesn't need anymore." Something moved through Ray's face that was terrifying in its vulnerability, the expression of a man who hasn't felt understood in a very long time and doesn't know what to do with it. "They're cutting my position too," Calvin said. "Today, 9 o'clock meeting. The whole supervisory tier. I didn't know until I put it together just now, standing here, but yeah, I'm getting the same paper you got." Ray blinked. "What? So I'm not your enemy, Ray. I'm standing in the same hole you are. The difference is what we do next." The gun lowered. Not fully, not decisively, but it dipped, and in that dip, in that fraction of a degree that separated everything from nothing, Calvin acted. Not with violence. With physics and training and the precise economy of a man who had learned, a long time ago, that force is not about size or anger. It's about timing and leverage and the willingness to commit completely to a single moment. He moved inside Ray's reach in one step, not toward the gun but past it, his left hand coming up and redirecting the barrel toward the ceiling as his right arm went under Ray's gun arm at the elbow and applied upward torque, a disarm technique so ingrained it required no thought, only the decision to begin. The Glock discharged once into the drop ceiling, a crack of sound that bounced off every wall and made Sandra cry out and Sadie press her sketchbook over her ears. The gun was in Calvin's hand before Ray fully processed that it had left his own. Ray stumbled back against the doorframe. He looked at his empty hand. He looked at Calvin. Calvin held the Glock at his side, pointed at the floor, and put his free hand up toward Ray, not threatening, not victorious, just present. "It's done, Ray," he said. "It's over." Ray Hollis, 58 years old, 19 years, bad knee, daughter at OSU, put both hands over his face. And he sat down on the break room floor and began to cry with the exhausted, broken release of a man who had just spent the worst 6 weeks of his life chasing a feeling of control and finally, horribly, run out of road. Calvin crouched in front of him. "Sandra," he said without looking up, "can you go to the stairwell window and wave down the officers? Tell them you need them up here, second floor, break room. Tell them the situation is contained." "Is it?" she asked, her voice thin. "Yeah," Calvin said. "It is." She went. He looked at Sadie. She was standing against the wall, sketchbook still against her chest, watching her father with an expression he would think about for a long time afterward. Not scared, exactly. Not quite in awe, exactly. Something in between, something that looked like recognition. Like she was finally seeing something she'd always known was there. "You okay, bug?" "Yeah." She looked at Ray, crying on the floor. Then back at Calvin. "Is he going to be all right?" Calvin paused. "That depends on a lot of things. But he's alive, and nobody got hurt. That's what today needed to be." Sadie thought about that. Then she sat down cross-legged on the floor, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw. Calvin could not explain, even later when he tried, why that was the moment he felt the most proud of her. Not when she'd followed instructions. Not when she'd stayed calm. When she'd sat down and started drawing. Like the world had just shown her something terrifying and she'd decided to make something from it. She was her mother's daughter. The police came up the stairwell 4 minutes later. 2 officers, hands on holsters, moving in the crouch-quick way that says training without saying it. Calvin identified himself, placed the Glock on the break room table grip first, and put both hands up. He explained, in precise and organized sentences, what had happened. One of the officers, a woman named Lieutenant Kravitz, short and efficient, with the kind of eyes that had processed a lot of situations, looked at him for a long moment. "Army," she said. "Rangers. Long time ago." She nodded once. "Good job, Mr. Marsh." The building was cleared over the next 40 minutes. 12 people filed out of conference room B into the hallway, where they stood in clusters with that particular stunned stillness of people who have just been returned to normalcy from somewhere close to the edge of it. There were tears and phone calls, and someone had apparently eaten the entire catered breakfast during the ordeal, which a detective noted with an expression of genuine bafflement. Jeffrey Prescott came out last. He was, for the first time in perhaps a long time, without his posture. It wasn't a dramatic change. He was still standing, still had his silver hair, still wore the slim-cut jacket. But something structural had gone out of him, the way tension leaves a cable when the weight is removed. He looked like a man who had sat in a corner of a room for 40 minutes thinking about things he had not thought about in quite some time. He saw Calvin in the hallway. He stopped. Calvin was leaning against the wall outside the break room, Sadie beside him, her sketchbook in her lap, adding to the drawing she'd started on the floor. Calvin had one hand on her shoulder, the way he always did when she was focused on something, not directing her, just there. Jeffrey walked toward them slowly. He stopped about 4 feet away. He looked at Calvin. He looked at Sadie. He looked at the sketchbook and the jalapeno chip wrapper on the floor beside her, and the visitor badge still clipped to her jacket. "She's yours," he said. "She's mine," Calvin said. Jeffrey looked like he was going to say something else. Several times his mouth opened, and something almost formed and then didn't. He was a man who was professionally fluent in language, in presentations and projections, and carefully worded communications. And he was standing in a hallway without any of his words. "I had a meeting this morning," he finally said. "At 9 o'clock. "I know," Calvin said. "I figured it out. Your position was on the list." "Yeah." A silence stretched between them like something physical. Jeffrey looked at the floor, then at Calvin's hands, then at his face. "I didn't know your name," Jeffrey said. "Before today. For years. And I didn't know your name." Calvin didn't say anything. He just waited. "That man in there," Jeffrey continued, his voice lower now, losing the executive register entirely. "Ray Hollis. I signed off on his separation 6 weeks ago." The consultant flagged his position. "I signed the form." I didn't know his name either." He said the last 4 words the way a person says something they've just truly understood for the first time, quietly, without excuse, with the specific weight of someone taking something on rather than deflecting it. "I sat in that room for 40 minutes, Jeffrey said, "thinking I was going to die. And the thing I kept thinking about," he stopped. "Tried again. I kept thinking about all the names I didn't know." Calvin looked at him for a moment. He thought about 19 years. He thought about a percolator from his mother and a thermos that said world's okayest dad and Thursdays at the range that nobody ever thought to ask about. "Then learn them," Calvin said. Jeffrey Prescott, CEO, silver-haired, slim-cut jacket, nodded slowly, like a man receiving a sentence he'd earned. Sadie looked up from her sketchbook. She studied Jeffrey with the frank, unguarded assessment that only children apply to adults. "Are you the boss?" she asked. Jeffrey blinked. "I am. My dad's really good at his job," she said. "In case you didn't know." Something happened to Jeffrey Prescott's face then, something that might have been the first genuinely unguarded expression he'd worn in a professional context in a very long time. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was more like a thaw. "I'm starting to understand that," he said. The weeks that followed were the kind that test whether a person's change is real or whether it's just shock wearing a reform costume. Jeffrey Prescott, as it turned out, was a man capable of being genuinely altered by what he'd been through. Not everyone is. Some people walk back into their lives after a crisis and reconstruct every wall. He didn't. Or at least, he tried not to. The outsourcing plan was canceled within 48 hours of the incident. The consulting firm was thanked and dismissed. The 12 positions remained. This was not announced with fanfare or a press release. partly because there was already enough press around the hostage situation, and partly because Jeffrey seemed to understand, at some level, that canceling the outsourcing wasn't a favor. It was a correction. Ray Hollis was charged with 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful restraint, and related charges. He didn't fight the charges. He had a public defender who got him into a diversion program pending a mental health evaluation, which concluded that Ray was experiencing a significant depressive episode compounded by crisis-level financial anxiety. He was sentenced to supervised probation and mandatory counseling. He would not go to prison. There was a victim impact statement submitted by Sandra Briggs that was noted in the courtroom as particularly measured and compassionate, which her colleagues at Cornerstone thought sounded exactly like her. Calvin was not required to submit a statement. He wrote one anyway. It was 4 paragraphs long, and it said, among other things, that he believed Ray Hollis was not a dangerous person but a desperate one, and that there was a distinction worth making, and that whatever the court decided, he hoped Ray got the kind of help that helped him figure out what to do next. Phil Denton read a news report about it and called Calvin from his car. "You wrote a statement for the guy who held a gun on your daughter?" Phil said. "He never pointed it at Sadie," Calvin said. "Calvin, he was in a bad place, Phil. He made a terrible choice. But I know what desperation looks like. And he wasn't. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man who ran out of road." A long pause. "You're a weird guy," Phil said. "You ate a submarine sandwich at 8 in the morning," Calvin replied. "Breakfast sub. Go home, Phil." Jeffrey Prescott called Calvin into his office 2 weeks after the incident. Not a summons, a request, formal but genuine, with an actual apology for the short notice. Calvin sat across the desk from a man who looked, in a way that was hard to define, slightly less armored than before. "I've been thinking about restructuring the security function of this company," Jeffrey said. "We've been outsourcing it. Contract guards, rotating staff, nobody who actually knows the building or the people in it. I'd like to change that." He paused. "I'd like to offer you a director of security operations position. It would involve building out a small internal team, overseeing safety protocols, working with local law enforcement on facility procedures." He named a salary. Calvin, who had never been offered anything like that number, kept his face neutral with the practiced ease of a man trained to control involuntary responses under pressure. "I'd also want you," Jeffrey continued, "to keep doing whatever you're doing with your daughter. I'd like to figure out what an on-site family assistance program looks like, so that when a babysitter cancels, the answer isn't bring your kid to a building with no childcare resources. I'm not saying I've got it all worked out. I'm saying I want to work it out." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he finally asked. Jeffrey looked at him. "Because I spent 40 minutes in a corner thinking about names. And when I came out, the first person I saw was you and your daughter, and he stopped. "Reorganized. I don't want to run a company full of people I don't see. That's what I've been doing. And look where it landed us." Calvin said. "Ray Hollis gave 19 years to this place. I know. You don't just cut 19 years without a conversation. I know that now." Jeffrey held his gaze. "I'm trying to do better with what I know now. That's all I can offer you." Calvin thought about the leaning fence and the dented percolator. He thought about Thursdays at the range and a conversation nobody had ever thought to have with him. He thought about Sadie drawing in the break room, the way she just opened her sketchbook and kept going, like resilience was something you chose rather than something that happened to you. "I'll think about it," Calvin said. He accepted the offer the next day. There is a detail from that morning. A small one, the kind that gets lost in the larger shape of events, that Calvin has only told one person. When he crossed the room to redirect Ray's arm. When he made the decision to act. In the instant before he moved, he thought of something Paulette had said to him once, early in their marriage, when he was still wrestling with whether to leave the Rangers, whether he'd be giving something up that he could never get back. She'd said, "The thing you've built doesn't go anywhere, Cal. It just waits. And the thing about waiting is, it's only a problem if you never needed it." He hadn't needed it. For 9 years, he hadn't needed it. And when he did, when everything that mattered most was in that room and the math of the moment was asking him to calculate the fastest, safest way through, it was there. Unchanged. Patient. Honest. He told Sadie about it, eventually. Not the Paulette part. Not yet. She wasn't ready for the full weight of her mother's words yet. But the idea behind it. They were in the backyard on a Thursday evening. He'd gotten back from the range early, and the sky was doing something the Tulsa sky occasionally does in April, going amber and violet at the edges, the kind of sunset that makes even a leaning fence look like it belongs. Sadie had her telescope out and was tracking something in the southeast sky with the single-minded focus she applied to everything she loved. "Dad," she said, not looking up. "How did you know what to do?" In the break room. He sat in the folding chair beside her. He thought about how to answer honestly and simply. "I practiced," he said. She looked at him then. "Practiced for that specifically?" "Practiced for the idea of it. The discipline of staying clear when everything wants you to panic." He paused. "You can't practice the exact situation. You can practice the part of yourself that handles the situation." She thought about that for a long moment. The way she thought about things, with the whole of her visible concentration. "Is that what Thursdays are for?" she asked. "Partly," he said. She nodded, satisfied in the way she was when an answer settled correctly into a larger understanding she'd been building. Then she turned back to her telescope. "I want to do Thursdays too," she said. "The range." "No. I want to practice something. I don't know what yet." She adjusted the focus. "I'll figure it out." He looked at her. His daughter. Paulette's eyes and his stubbornness and 9 years of early mornings and packed backpacks and one very memorable April Tuesday and 1,000 sea otter documentaries. "Yeah," he said. "You will." Jeffrey Prescott did eventually learn everyone's name. Not immediately. It was not the kind of change that happens in a week. It was the kind of change that happens in the daily choice to do something differently, one person at a time, one conversation at a time, until the new habit replaces the old one so completely that you stop noticing the effort. He started having lunch in the cafeteria on Tuesdays. Just Tuesdays at first, then more often. He learned that Phil Denon's dog was named Sprocket, and that Sandra Briggs had a younger sister who was a nurse in Albuquerque, and that the woman who managed the second loading dock had been trying to get a community college certification for 2 years, but kept losing the time to it. And he quietly set up a tuition reimbursement program that he probably should have had a decade ago. He learned, in the way that some people only learn from the inside of a very hard moment, that a company is not its revenue projections, or its efficiency metrics, or its third-party logistics provider in Kansas City. It's its people. The particular, irreplaceable, not a line item people who pack backpacks in the dark and bring broken percolators from their mothers and eat submarine sandwiches at 8 in the morning and keep skills on shelves they hope they'll never need. He would say, in an interview 2 years later, a local business magazine, the kind with a modest readership and good questions, that the April 11th incident had been the most clarifying experience of his professional life, and not for the reasons people assumed. "Everyone assumes it was the fear," he said. "The gun, the hostage situation. People think that's what changed me. But I had 40 minutes in that room before Calvin walked in. And the fear wasn't the thing. The thing was the inventory. Sitting there doing an inventory of every person in that building whose name I didn't know." He paused. "That's a terrible feeling. If you ever get the chance to do that inventory without a gun in the room, I highly recommend it. The interviewer asked if he'd stayed in contact with Calvin Marsh. Jeffrey smiled. He works down the hall. Calvin still takes Sadie to the range sometimes, on Saturdays now, because it's her idea and he's not going to be the one to discourage it. She shoots with the serious, methodical focus she brings to everything she cares about. She's not bad. She'll be better. She still has the drawing she made on the break room floor that morning. The one she started while her father crouched across from a man with an empty gun hand and decided what came next. She framed it herself with a pale blue mat from the craft store, and it hangs above her desk. It is a drawing of a man standing in a doorway with the light coming from somewhere behind him. You can't see his face, but you know who it is. Calvin asked her once what she was thinking when she drew it. She shrugged the way 9-year-olds shrug when they're actually thinking about something deep. I just wanted to remember what it looked like, she said. When you came in, what did it look like? She thought about it. Like someone who already knew what they were going to do, she said. Even before they did it. He didn't say anything. He just put his arm around her, and they stood there for a minute in the particular quiet that belongs to people who know something that words don't quite fit. Outside, the Tulsa sky was doing its thing again, all amber and violet and stubborn ordinary beauty, the kind that shows up every evening without being asked, patient as anything, there when you need it. Calvin Marsh looked at his daughter's drawing. He thought about Paulette. He thought about 19 years and assigned paper and how desperation wears 1,000 different faces. He thought about a CEO who had sat in a corner and taken inventory of the names he didn't know. He thought about the Thursday evenings that nobody asked about. He thought about a tool in a case, latched shut, patient on a shelf. He thought about scared and able being different things. And then he went and made dinner, because Sadie had requested macaroni for the 3rd time this week, and some battles are simply not worth fighting. If you made it this far, then you know what this story is really about. It's not about a single father being a hero, though he was one, in every sense of the word. It's not about a CEO having an epiphany, though he had one, and it stuck. It's about what we carry. What we keep sharp even when no one sees us keeping it. What we build inside ourselves in the quiet years that nobody narrates, nobody records, nobody marks with a memorial, or a medal, or a 9 o'clock news segment. It's about what was already in that room when the gun came out. Calvin Marsh didn't become someone that morning. He revealed himself. And the most powerful thing about that, the thing that Jeffrey Prescott would spend years trying to articulate, was not the technique, not the training, not the speed or the calm or the economy of the movement. It was the reason. A man stepping into the path of something terrible not because he was fearless, but because standing still, while his daughter was on the other side of a locked bathroom door, was simply not an option he was willing to take. That's what left the CEO speechless. Not the action, the why behind it. The unshakable, ordinary, unremarkable, extraordinary why. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and the bell. We put out stories like this every week. And if you know someone who needs to hear this one, share it. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right time. We'll see you next time on Crest Stories.